So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Aidan Choles, and it's a real privilege to welcome you to our session today on World Sustainable Procurement Day. We are dialing in from sunny South Africa. Today is the 21st of March, which is a public holiday here in South Africa, Human Rights Day. And that's quite special because for us to be talking about how supply chains and procurement can contribute to a sustainable world, human rights is a key focus. And so on this day, it's our privilege and pleasure to be sharing some time with you and some conversation with you as we unpack what that means for emerging markets. And that's really the headline of our session, is we are hoping to unpack what makes emerging markets like South Africa and others unique for sustainable procurement. So my name is Aidan Choles. I am from DBK Advisory. I'm a director at DBK Advisory. And what we do is we help organizations, both individual and sectoral, understand the whole value that they are contributing to the world, using the SDGs as a lens for understanding both the contribution and the impacts that organizations have. And when it comes to understanding the buying power and the purchasing power of supply chains and procurement, that's a key focus for us because there are multiple levers that can be moved through purchasing and procurement, specifically for contributing to a sustainable world, and even more specifically for how that plays a role in emerging markets like South Africa. I'm going to be the moderator for the next hour or so with you. So it's really a great privilege to have you with us. As usual, when it comes to online platforms like this, you have the opportunity to pose questions to the panel, who I'm going to introduce shortly. We really encourage you to be throwing your questions at us. We want this to be as conversational as possible. The gentlemen that I'm with today have done a lot of preparation. They're deep experts in their domains, but we really want to hear your questions as well. So please pop on over to the Q&A box and contribute your questions. The chat box is live as well. And so that's where you can interact with each other. It would be really awesome for us to know who is joining us. And so please let us know, where you are in the world, what your interest is. And we're going to make some dedicated time for the Q&A at the back end of the session. So let's just do a quick round of introductions, and I'm going to kick off with some opening thoughts. So it's my pleasure to introduce Ashton Ramlachan, who's the Principal for Sustainable Supply Chain at Anglo American. Ashton, you can unmute yourself and just say a quick hello. It's good to have you with us.
Yeah, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Absolute pleasure to be here this morning.
Great, thanks, Ashton. Then next up introduction is Alan Hilton, who is the Managing Director of ArcBlue Africa Technologies. Alan, unmute yourself and say a hello to everyone.
Thank you, Aidan. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everybody. Pleasure to be here. Look forward to some positive engagements. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. And then last but not least is Simon Peller. Simon is the Head of Procurement at Yang Feng. So Simon, good to have you with us. Just unmute yourself and say hello.
Yeah, hello everybody. I'm Simon. It's a pleasure to be here with you, with all of you, and yeah, I'm looking forward to have a nice conversation with all of you to check what we can do maybe in South Africa and in emerging markets differently.
Brilliant. Thanks, Simon. So, gentlemen, it's really good to be with you. And so the objective of our session, ladies and gentlemen, is unpacking that question of how emerging markets like South Africa can be a unique opportunity for sustainable procurement. There are opportunities and there are challenges, and so we're going to be upfront and honest about that in our conversation today. But really what we want to try and do, and the objective of the session, is provide a macroeconomic view of South Africa and how the SDGs are being used as a lens to drive alignment through supply chains and through corporates. And so we'll then be drilling down into focusing on the positive economic and technological potential within an emerging market like South Africa. And so there are multiple challenges at play as multinationals consider, what to look for when seeking for destinations for investment or diversification into emerging markets. There are multiple touch points we're going to be picking up on, and then there are the challenges. And so the opportunity in the session today is to hear from people who are located in this market, who are grappling with the real opportunities, the real challenges, to reflect on what that means for sustainable procurement. And as a lead into that, I've mentioned the SDGs before we will hear from Ashlyn and his inputs. Just a couple of thoughts, because we use as we've prepped for this session, we've used the SDGs as a bit of a North Star, if you like, for understanding what a sustainable world looks like. And so the Sustainable Development Goals are a key lens for us. And I just want to ground our conversation and what that means with a couple of thoughts. The first is that the SDGs represent inherent needs for the world, if you like, and they're connected to the reality of the world that we operate. And this is important because they set the target for achievement by 2030. And if you haven't realized, time is running out. 2030 is fast approaching. And we often see these fancy icons, these nice colors that embody the SDGs, and we often speak about them as the UN's SDGs. But for this conversation, I want us to be really grounded in the fact that these are needs. The 17 goals touch on needs that we experience and are real in our world. They're not out there belonging to the UN. They are visible and felt for us. And so then when it comes to sustainable procurement, it's really about the opportunity of meeting ESG needs, looking at what we can do from an environment, social, and governance perspective in addressing these needs. But this is the one reason why the SDGs are helpful, is because ESG is quite a narrow categorization, whereas the 17 SDGs are a bit broader, and then bring into focus fundamentally the economic imperative of business, of supply chains, of value chains. ESG in and of itself is decoupled from the economic imperative. And so one of the things that we're going to be grappling with in the conversation today is how do we recouple the economic imperative? And that's important because it's not just crucial for viability and success of individual businesses and the impacts that they have, but this is important for value chains. And this is why this conversation today is so important, is because the questions that the SDGs ask are now being asked through entire value chains. So today we'll focus on what this means from an upstream perspective, looking at what you can do with procurement in your supply chain. But this is important for customers. And these questions are being asked both upstream, midstream, and downstream. And the poster child, if you like, for sustainable procurement is SDG 12, responsible consumption and production. So that's really the pinnacle of the conversation today, and what you can be thinking about is how do we unpack what responsible production and consumption looks like in an emerging market like South Africa. But it's Human Rights Day in South Africa, and we know that decent work and economic growth and how that contributes to SDG 1, improving poverty. Those are two next in line SDGs, if you like, that touch on the reality of the world that we operate within, and that our suppliers and our value chain is feeling. And so this question of how do we move forward on the question of decent work and how that plays a role in human health as well. And then that contributes to SDG 10 fundamentally, of how we reduce inequalities. And that's one of the key levers, if you like, around what we do, and the levers that we pull in our supply chain is how we reduce inequalities. And then lastly, just the pinnacle and the last thought from me. So Ashlyn, this is the little tip for you to get ready as we will kick off the conversation with you. SDG 17, partnerships for the goals, is really the value embodiment, if you like, for the conversations, because that asks the question, how do we do this together? We can't do it alone. Governments can't do it alone. That much we know. But the private sector and businesses can't do it alone. So how do we come together and do this in a collaborative way and unlock the value, the principles, if you like, of partnership and collaboration? And so I'm looking forward to how we're going to unpack this with Ashlyn, with Alan and Simon in the conversation that goes ahead. Again, reminder, please be contributing your questions to us. And then right as we wrap up, once we get through the conversation, we'll have some Q&A. I'm then going to share a practical tool with you that you might want to be able to use, just if you want to get a view of how your business is aligning to the SDGs, how your data lines up. And so stay tuned for that as well. But the three topics that we're really going to uncover today that Ashlyn and Simon and Alan are going to be talking about is we're going to be looking at and unpacking what the best practices for sustainable procurement in emerging markets are. So that's what Ashlin's going to be speaking about. Alan's going to help us then get our heads around what the technological opportunities are there that we could unlock for supply chain resilience in the face of the challenges. And then lastly, Simon's going to be chatting to us about how we can overcome some of the barriers that we encounter when it comes to sustainable procurement in an emerging market like South Africa. So that's enough from me. Ashlyn, I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself and start coming in. Maybe just a couple of initial thoughts from your side in terms of this question of, well, what are the best practices that you're seeing around responsible and sustainable procurement in an emerging market like South Africa? Ashlyn?
Great. Thank you so much, Aidan. And before I kick it off, I just want to acknowledge the South African members of the SPP on the call. I acknowledge, guys, that this is a public holiday, and I appreciate you taking time off the long weekend to be part of this. And I think, Aidan, that reiterates with the principle that you spoke about. So how do we take this day, Human Rights Day, which is really important to us as a country, as a nation, and translate those into key actions that we as corporates look at, and look at this intersectionality between international legislation, what governments are driving, and the role that each of us could play. To answer that, I've got two vignettes I'll speak about. So one example comes from the mining sector, where I'm very fortunate to work within, and the other one comes from the wider FMCG sector, where I spent a fair amount of my young days. Before I get into that, though, I just want to acknowledge something else which is probably unique about this group. So if I reflect on Alan and Simon, both of them foreign gentlemen, both living in South Africa, Aidan, if I think about your global experience, and if I think about the things that we're speaking about, something that really stands out from this audience, and something which is reflective of many emerging markets, especially ones like South Africa, is that diversity. And I want to start there because I think it's so critical to acknowledge that with that diversity, we're able to bring in different opinions, different viewpoints, different expertise to complement us on these growth journeys. And I think it's fortuitous, and it's also a bit of kismet that we've got a really talented panel that speaks to that and is able to drive much of what we're speaking about. So I'm going to speak to you, like I said, two vignettes. The first is on this bigger issue of how do we as supply chains reduce inequality by creating economic growth, so bringing two of the SDGs or primary SDGs together. And in South Africa, and similarly in many emerging markets, you've got huge commitments by governments to drive levels of innovation and levels of sustainability when it comes to introducing the private sector and creating linkages in that private sector. South Africa is no example. I think we're probably one of the most advanced countries when it comes to how does that partnership look and what role do corporates need to play to actually drive more sustainable value chains. So to deep dive into the South African markets and some of the things that are quite unique in our space, we've got so within our legislation, and we've got a very complex legislative background and mechanism, so I'm not going to endorse all of it, but some of the really interesting parts is the commitment that we've put towards supply development when companies get evaluated and when companies look at their legitimacy to create social license. And one of the really interesting mechanisms that we've set up as a country is where companies are incentivized to spend up to 2% of their net profits after tax into supplier development programs. Now, what's really important to highlight is that when they speak about supply development, this isn't your typical investments in social investment. These are deliberate, targeted investments in capacity within that value chain that you work within. And we've seen some incredible examples in the country. We've seen big businesses diversify parts of their supply chain, so focusing on what's their core business versus parts of their business that they could basically farm out to smaller businesses and help diversify the income streams of small businesses. You've seen that supported by mechanisms which allow for preferential access to finance, whether that's actual capex investments or whether that's payment terms. You see direct investments in skills, and that goes all the way to creating centers where folks can get upskilled in certain technical abilities. You see direct investments in schools programs, university programs to create a line of folks that can actually come up and meet that challenge that corporates are leading. So we see some really creative mechanisms where companies are applying themselves around supply development, trying to get to that magic mix of what works both from a corporate perspective, but what also drives value. Because when we talk about supply development, it's a very different discussion compared to the CSI discussion that was prevalent, say, 20, 25 years ago. While CSI dealt primarily with philanthropy, supply development, and enterprise development, and I'll speak about the nuance between those, is something that, if done smartly and properly, helps create incremental value, driving both social license and creating business competition. So let me expand on that a little bit. There's always hesitation when one comes to emerging markets about how viable it is to work in an emerging market. And it's easy to find examples of where things don't work. But if we took a step back and if we took a 20, 30, 40-year view and we asked ourselves what's going to drive reliability in value chains, what's going to create more social cohesion, what's going to stop things like protests because people feel marginalized from economic situations. It comes down to the way we look at our procurement and the way we're able to build inclusive supply chains. So to give you an example of the organization that I work within, we have a $15 billion annual procurement budget. If we divert 1% of that towards localized spend, that's $150 million going into an economy, going into a community and creating a huge multiplier effect, which in turn helps lift the entire level of communities up and create opportunities for business growth and eventually business diversification, where companies like ours that create that initial seed, that initial push, become hopefully secondary customers to a whole new value chain that we help develop and create. One of the other big benefits of localization and driving localization, especially at a host community level, is to increase turnaround. And that's a really critical thing. We see examples all over the world where you have fly in, fly out teams. You've got limited technical competency or knowledge based on site. And by localizing skills, what you do is you have multiple benefits, right? So aside from increasing turnaround, because you can get teams faster if there's a breakdown, for example, you ultimately increase the skills base in host communities, which means you create more competition, which selfishly as a supply chain gives us more options and potentially better prices. But when I speak about prices, it's not at the expense of what's fair pay for good service. It's saying you're taking out this entire leg where you've got overseas expertise or you've got expertise that need to fly in versus local expertise. And over time, that creates massive scale. By getting localization right, you also hedge yourself from foreign exchange fluctuations. And emerging markets, and if you look at South Africa's performance over the last month, if you invested against South Africa, so if you bought our rands on a short, you would have made a fair amount of money. The converse could be said. So if you invest smartly in the country, in basic infrastructure, in basic support, you buffer yourself against when currencies like ours devaluate, and they do tend to devaluate. Alternatively, what you also do is you create this really interesting forex buffer where you're able to get the benefit where currencies pick up, or you are able to more accurately guesstimate any potential losses if you've got a good understanding of where your value chain comes from. Helping building local skills is the ultimate benefit, and often we don't speak about that, but the benefit of that is it's multifold, because ultimately if you're able to create good examples using supply development mechanisms, driving the way your supply chain looks, you create legitimacy in the organization and create livelihoods for everybody impacted by the decisions. And Aidan, I've realized I've gone well past by 3 minutes. I'll speak for literally 30 seconds more on the second part, which is it's something really important to me, and it speaks about decent work, economic growth, and something quite important in our Bill of Rights, the prevention of slavery, servitude, and forced labor. And what we're seeing in markets like ourselves, like ours, you see a really interesting dynamic. So Aidan mentioned a customer poll where you've got customers asking very specific questions about traceability of your value chain. Customers want to know that that coffee that they buy, that piece of metal that comes out of the ground, is produced under conditions which are fair, which are ethical and not at the expense of human beings or the planet at the back end of that. And there's some really amazing examples across multiple sectors that we see being driven both from a customer perspective, but also being complemented by a very strong legal framework where the rights of individuals against exploitation are being upheld at every level. If I think about the wine sector and being a public holiday, I can speak freely about drinking wine after this session. If I think about the wine sector, we've got well-established programs where every bottle of wine produced in South Africa and exported or sold domestically will have a sustainability certification attached to it. And what that provides is an assurance to customers all over the world that the way the grapes were harvested, the way these grapes were processed, the way these things were bottled, everyone impacted by the value chain has got a fair deal from this. And there's multiple assurance programs that help provide both support to farmers on the ground, to small businesses in that value chain, and ultimately to customers on the back end. And what we're seeing is, and it's really positive, what we're seeing is a massive resurgence of interest about where people get what they get from. And what I find amazing is that the adaptability of emerging markets, even small scale emerging markets, to be much more receptive to their customers and seek to differentiate what they do, exist far more than we see in more established markets. To give you one example before I close up and to put Simon a bit on the back foot, if you think about Germany, which has one of the most complicated and advanced legal systems in the world, it's only in December last year that Germany passed the Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, which compels organizations to understand their value chains better and be able to attest for any issues in that value chain and be able to have remediative measures in play for people impacted by poor decisions made in that value chain. We suspect by the end of this year, you'll have over 20 other EU nations pushing for traceability of value chains, and that comes down to how our supply chains are configured. You've also seen things like the Xinjiang Forced Labor Act coming live in the US at the back end of last year. Again, forcing companies, forcing countries to have a much clearer understanding of human rights impacts in their value chain and challenging the way we're able to do things differently. So folks, thank you very much. I'll be part of the panel. Looking forward to, I think I've just got the juices going. So looking forward to great dialogue.
Certainly, Ashton. Thanks for that. And the Q&A and the chat have been coming alive as well. And so Ashton, thanks for that. There are going to be a couple of threads that I think we'll pull together in the Q&A at the back end of our session. But while you've been speaking, Ashton, maybe also you want to pop over to the Q&A and chat and see there are a couple of things that you can be responding to there. But Alan, I want to tee you up now next as we move on to the next part of our conversation. So Ashton's given us some of that context around what is happening in the emerging markets and the supply chain and what those best practices could be. But with you, Alan, now we're going to use the opportunity to drill down on a specific aspect around the technological opportunities that present themselves. So so over to you, Alan, your initial thoughts, and let me know when I should bring up your slide.
Thank you for that wonderful presentation, Ashlyn. Thank you for the introduction, Aidan. Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Additive manufacturing is really where I'm heading with my talk. It's a technology that has the potential to revolutionize the way products are manufactured and distributed. One of the key benefits is that it can enable local production of parts, which can lead to reduce the need for shipping components overseas, and that's essentially where the sustainability comes in. So the benefits, or the use of additive manufacturing as a mechanism to address sustainable goals, extends far and wide, but I've captured just a few of those critical points. Of course, the positive side is the environmental impact. Because we're not shipping as many components, we don't contribute as much CO2 to the environment. An obvious contribution there. The social impacts, without having to ship parts, it means we have to think more about how we're going to produce these locally. So reducing the carbon footprint, producing locally, we can avoid the need to transport parts over long distances, which can help to reduce that carbon footprint. The other aspect is the reduced waste. Additive manufacturing can enable the production of parts on demand, which means we don't need to keep parts stored in warehouses. So there's a cost saving there, huge, significant cost saving, especially in the mining sector, where they do tend to keep a lot of parts stored in the event of, and in many cases, those parts aren't actually used. So the benefits of keeping parts on a cloud, let's say, and then downloaded as and when required, you can already see the huge benefits there. Of course, the supply chain resilience challenges that we've had recently, in particular the pandemic, by minimizing the amount of parts that's being shipped internationally, we can start to address those supply chain resilience challenges. So maximizing local production can help to reduce the risks associated with supply chain disruptions. Economic benefits, of course, local production will create jobs and stimulate the local economy. And of course, those jobs are high value jobs, which is definitely something we need here in South Africa. Some of the challenges. Sorry.
Yep. No. Should I bring up your slide? Would that?
Yes, please. Yes, please.
All right. And while I tee it up, Alan, and thanks for highlighting some of the benefits associated with additive manufacturing. But maybe you want to give us the other side of the coin now. What are some of the likely challenges?
Yeah. So the likely challenges. Equipment's expensive. It's very expensive. And will require specialized skills and expertise. And also not every part is suitable for additive manufacturing. A lot depends on the size of the component, the geometry, tensile strengths, a lot of technical reasons why additive manufacturing is not suitable for every single component. But as my background is automotive, I tend to look at that side more than anything. I know 50,000 parts per vehicle, at least 10 at the moment, 10 to 20% of those parts can be 3D printed. And so the question, begs the question, why are we shipping these simple components? I'm talking about non-structural components, components that do not need a long lead time to get qualified and certified. But of course, additive manufacturing has to meet all the standards, the ISO standards necessary to be suitable for the automotive industry. So while additive manufacturing is not a solution for all the challenges associated with sustainable procurement, it can be one of those useful tools when procurement are looking to reduce their environmental impact and improve their supply chain resilience. So by investing in this technology and exploring the opportunities it presents, we can start to contribute towards a more sustainable and resilient global economy. The diagram you see in front of you here just illustrates very quickly and easily on the left side the current state where components are shipped physically, literally. I've used the BRICS communities as an example, just as a pilot, just to test the model. Potentially, physical components are being imported and exported, and a lot of these could be manufactured locally. So it begs the question, after shipping parts internationally, you have to wait 6 to 9 weeks sometimes for the part to arrive locally. And it is, when you think about it, it is quite inefficient and also environmentally unfriendly, especially when the technology is there for us to be able to print parts on demand as and when needed. And that's really where the future state on the right-hand side looks at. It looks at how we can start thinking about shipping data to each other. And again, I've used the BRICS member states as an example of a pilot we could potentially look at and consider. This model looks at really optimizing trade between the member states and how the supply chains could be modified and adjusted to think about the use of digital additive manufacturing more as a mechanism to produce parts locally instead of shipping them across borders. There are social and environmental benefits, the shorter lead times, of course, We got 1 to 2 days typically on average to get a part printed, whereas we're talking 6 to 9 weeks on average for a part to come from Europe or US or in China. Parts are competitive in the long term. There is an issue with pricing because of the smaller volumes and the expense of the machine, the amortization of costs. It does make that part sometimes more expensive. But when we look at the broader picture of creating jobs locally, developing the local economy, we start to see the external benefits of paying that additional price, and maybe that's something we need to consider. Of course, it contributes towards addressing supply chain resilience, which, as I've mentioned, pandemic really hit all of us globally. And so perhaps this is one mechanism by which we can look to consider how we could optimize the supply of parts. Adrian?
And then Alan, thank you. I mean, so you really well stated around some of those challenges. If you had to drill it down to an emerging markets focus now, what are some of the benefits or risks or even upsides of then introducing additive manufacturing in emerging markets?
Thank you, Adrian. Yeah, we can take that slide down now if you wish. So some of the challenges, can include limited access to sustainable materials. A lack of regulation is a critical point, and the enforcement thereof. Difficulty in ensuring supply chain transparency, and limited resources for sustainable procurement initiatives. That's certainly one area. However, sustainable procurement can bring a range of benefits, such as reducing the environmental impact, as mentioned, improving that social responsibility, and reducing costs in the long term. Third point, perhaps we could look at, is the introducing additive manufacturing. It is possible to reduce the need for imports and exports. And of course, we need to look closely at what's the impact of that. But we're talking about components, physical components, and manufactured locally, thereby reducing transportation and emissions and costs thereof. The challenges associated with the adoption of this technology includes the lack of technical experience and expertise, the infrastructure, and the training. Additionally, there may also need to establish the supply chain relationships. How's that going to work? A company that typically sends a part, that part has been identified as one that could be digitally manufactured locally. What happens to that supplier? We need to start understanding from perhaps even a government policy perspective to ensure that trade is evenly spread out. That's something we need to explore more. Overall, the introduction of additive manufacturing can be a promising solution for reducing the environmental impact of manufacturing and improving sustainability in the emerging markets. However, careful consideration of the potential benefits and risks and challenges necessary to achieve this also need to be further explored in order to make it a huge success.
So then, Alan, what are the challenges for the introduction and the use of additive manufacturing cross borders?
So as I mentioned, I believe government interventions will be critical here. Policies will need to be looked at to see how trade is maintained and people don't lose out too much in one country. So there needs to be a balance. But government interventions will be necessary because there will be a need to consider the impact of local business from a loss of revenue perspective. Governments will need to be encouraged and motivated to look at the optimization of trade, what makes sense given the nature of that particular part, the CO2 footprint, the lead time to ship overseas, the rising costs of transportation. All must be offset against the country's need as a whole to achieve its sustainable procurement objectives. That's really as much as I want to talk about on the cross borders. But in summary, I believe that digital manufacturing and distribution of parts is a natural next step for the global economy. And I also believe procurement should be looking more closely at products that could be manufactured using digital technology. After all, shipping of parts, as I mentioned earlier, 6 to 9 weeks, is when you think about it, very inefficient and environmentally unfriendly. And so we need to be looking at the sustainability aspect of this more and more as procurement professionals. So for me, it's evident that sustainable procurement poses a unique challenge in emerging markets. However, the benefits such as reducing environmental impact, improving social responsibility, and reducing the cost long term cannot be ignored. So additive manufacturing it's a promising solution to reduce imports and exports, and can help to mitigate those challenges while promoting sustainable procurement practices. So as we move forward, just in closing, it's important to consider the potential risks and challenges associated with this, and to work towards establishing the necessary infrastructure, expertise, the supply chain relationships, how that all comes together. And by doing so, we can move towards a more sustainable and resilient future for both the economy as well as the environment. So thank you for your attention. That's really what I wanted to share today. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Alan. Much appreciated. And just a reminder, Alan is the MD of Arc Blue, so please reach out to him. And Alan, thanks for outlining that as a specific example for us to be considering from a technological perspective. But we're going to move on, and just because we want to make up some time for Q&A and conversation at the back end. So Simon, that's your heads up that we're coming to you now, and kind of then I guess bringing the conversation a bit full circle to then say, well, there are barriers. We're honest about that. We're upfront about it. But there are also ways to consider that we can overcome those barriers. So Simon, very keen to hear your thoughts around how we can navigate around those barriers to sustainable procurement in a market like South Africa. So Simon, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Aidan, and hello also from me to everybody in the audience. And Aidan, like you mentioned, there are barriers, and when we developed this topic over the last couple of weeks, we chatted about the barriers in South Africa or maybe in emerging markets. And if I'm looking what challenges I'm seeing, I'm from Germany. I'm since 4 years now in South Africa, so I have a quite, I would say, an understanding of the markets. And as it was mentioned from Alan and Ashlyn before, sustainable procurement sometimes comes with additional costs, or it comes also with having the awareness of sustainable procurement and what is behind of it. And my feeling is that in South Africa, the drive of sustainable procurement is more or less coming from multinational companies, big companies like Ashlyn is working in, Anglo America, or a company where I'm working in from automotive sector. But if you look in the smaller companies, local companies, the awareness about sustainable procurement and why it is so important, I think there is a lot of things still to do. And what I learned is getting more involved in SPP, or also our company has a great drive of sustainability. I learned much more about sustainability in the last 3 years. And I think our responsibility is to raise this awareness in the local market, to chat with the local companies, to create a network and build a network, and to share the informations what we have and why is it so important to drive further on sustainability in South Africa. Because the companies and the local companies, they are really challenged in South Africa. If we are just looking at the topic of load shedding, or for the people who are not aware, what is load shedding? It's a shortage of power. So we have sometimes 6 to 9 hours a day, no electricity in the country. And for sure, that is creating problems in the production areas, that is creating problems with getting an income, create workplaces. And that are barriers what we are having in South Africa. It was also mentioned from Alan or Ashlyn, skill sets. So we are bringing a lot of technology to the country. For example, our company, we involved a lot of new machines here with a lot of robot and technologies in, but we are seeing that there is a lack of skill set, or sometimes we are developing and training our people, and then they are leaving the country because they want to do they found another opportunity outside of South Africa, and that is creating challenges and barriers in the country. But on the other side, what can we do? So we as procurement professionals, we have the opportunity to raise the awareness in the supply chain. We can look for new companies. We can look for smaller businesses, like Ashley mentioned. If we're just using 1% of our procurement power and developing the smaller businesses and work with them, I think there is a lot of potential what we can do. We can put requirements in our contracts, like, for example, we received from our OEMs, we received the request to have 100% of green energy in South Africa for the next upcoming project. And we can also support this activity by ourselves and work with our suppliers and say, hey, if you want to do business with us, then we would like to invite you as well to go green. And our company, we've been quite successful on that. So we just introduced 3,500 solar panels to both of our production plants, and that is supporting the reduction of CO2. So 2,500 tons of CO2 reduction per 1 year, only for one company who added solar panels into the system. But on the other side, when we started this project, and there we are coming back to the barriers and the challenges, we had a lot of discussions with the landlords, with the local municipality, because electricity, for example, in South Africa is a monopolistic market, and they was not really open to support the idea to put solar panels on, because sure, they are losing business on their side. But with a lot of discussions, with a lot of convincing arguments, with a lot of support from our leadership team, we've been lately able to install the solar panels. And now we are the first companies in both of the supplier parks who has solar panels on, and everybody around us is interested how we did that, how we developed the contracts, and what benefits we have. So if you stay motivated by yourself, if you have an own goal, then sure, that can also support the idea of to have more sustainability in the country.
Thank you so much, Simon. So Debbie had me chuckling in the chat just now around the dance that we're having to do around the electricity challenges, and it just made me think about how some of the resilience that's being built in supply chains is actually a skill at being able to be nimble and nimble-footed on the dance floor. So point well made. But Ashlyn, maybe if I can come to you just for a comment, as you know, you kicked us off and you've heard the conversation unfold. Where's your head at now as you reflect on some of these opportunities and challenges? Maybe you want to talk about some of the lessons around electricity security and supply locally. Keen to hear from you.
Yeah, thanks, Aidan. And look, Debbie, 100% agree. I think we live in a slightly different world where we're trying to make sense of how to continue business and have things running. So from the mining sector, I'm quite proud to announce that, this is public, quite proud to share that we, as companies, I think government's taken a very different perspective in terms of the granting of licenses and concessions for independent power production. So we've got a team, an Anglo-global team, that's been looking at how do we supplement the incredible energy supply that we need, both for mining, but particularly for minerals processing. And we're embarking on setting up effectively some of the largest both solar and wind installations to feed not just our sites, but communities around the sites. And I think the negotiations with government have been very positive because it alleviates a lot of capacity constraints, which we clearly deal with, but also supports a cogeneration of electricity with government. And that's a really positive thing. So I think the conversation has certainly changed in the last few months. And I think there's been a lot more open door policy around opportunities to provide generation capacity and support for the business. It's still, I think Simon's example is probably one of the best practices in terms of both the speed and jumping through the hoops to get there. But I think it's almost at a blueprint for the way companies are seeking the challenge of providing into our grid and infrastructure support through generation of renewables on an independent power basis.
Great, thanks, Ashton. And so maybe then a question to all three of you, and maybe a bit of a challenging one, is because, you know, in the face of a crisis, there's a need and a rush to get security, to make sure that you've got provision of what you need. But as I reflect on the chat, a couple of comments that have come through is around where the different emphases are when we look at ESG and we apply an ESG lens to the world, that maybe there's a predominance of focus on the S and social in some respects, or an E, looking at the environment side, or when it comes to electricity supply, it's the economic side. And the question I wonder is, are we seeing a breakdown in the walls between E, S, and G? And a using of the opportunity, let's talk electricity supply, for maybe, you know, being progressive around including social upliftment, skills development, community involvement in those sorts of projects. Simon, keen to hear from you. Ellen, you know, have you seen these sorts of considerations taking hold in both the design and the delivery of these sorts of projects that look to make sure that there's security of supply?
Yeah, and I think for me that all goes together. If I'm looking in a country like South Africa, it's skills, it's receiving education for kids. With education, you can build up, maybe you can find a workplace, and you can support your family, and all these things comes together. But I think what we as procurement professionals can really do is we can support the people and the economy. So we as Yanfeng, we had, for example, we will have a social support with a local school. So we will do a donation of a whole solar system together with a company which we use to install the solar panels. So I visited last week this school, and in this school there are 152 little children and they are getting education there. And the school is, for example, it's a complete non-profit organization. So they are not receiving any money from the government. Everything is donated. And they reached out to us and asked, hey, is there any possibility if you can help us? Because that would have two positive aspects. On one side, they will save their electricity costs because we take them completely off the grid. And on the other side, with this money, what they are saving, they can have more kids and more education for the people available. So, but all comes with in the leadership positions, in the positions where we are in, where we can make decisions. We need to be open-minded and look for opportunities and check where can we make a difference. And that is, for me, I think, especially for South Africa or for the people in the audience, if you are in a procurement position, then put that first and have a look to what can we make as a difference.
Thanks, Simon. Much appreciated. And Ellen, if we come to you, do you have a view on how these dynamics and considerations are playing out from a cross-border multinational perspective, regionally, and what some of those dynamics are?
Yeah, you know, my view is quite broad. I understand ESG is now becoming a critical measure in a lot of the major organizations, but you know, how do we break that down? They are totally, entirely different animals, if you like. You know, you've got the environment on one side, social and the governance, and they all come together, and they are forming increasingly a measure for performance of organizations, as we've all recognized, I'm sure. When I talk about digital manufacturing, we're talking so far ahead, and yet still we haven't got the basics right yet here. We've still got to get those basics right, and electricity is one of those, and having regular power supply is key to being able to adopt an additive manufacturing environment. So, I'm keen to see how we're going to get those basics right here in SA, and so that we can thrive as a country. So for me, I represent a non-profit where we look to educate on the social side. We're looking to upskill SMEs in the art of digital manufacturing, because we are currently educating people, upskilling people, SMEs in the traditional manufacturing space. But there is an increasing need from organizations that we upskill people to be more digitally aware, digital manufacturing. So there's a gap there that we're looking to fill, to make sure that we're churning out people from incubators and from educational systems that align to corporate requirements, and hope to plug that gap. So I'll stop.
Thanks, Alan. Yeah, much appreciated. And I think one of the real opportunities, Simon, it was you were talking about the leadership focus and mindset is to really have more of an integrated view of this. Just one example for me is when we look at what's happening around sustainable finance and the capital needs required for investment in the sorts of infrastructure projects for both energy, water, whatever they might be. Those are significant opportunities to create localization and not just drop these in communities, but to actually partner in a fundamentally different way, so that the procurement process of those and the implementation of those capital projects maybe has an uptick in financial inclusion, entrepreneurship, skills development. That's one of the ways that I think we can certainly be doing that in the local economy. And then maybe just to close, last question I'm going to put to the panel before we do closing round of comments was a challenging question that popped up in the Q&A around the circular economy. And do we see this as actually being a real construct, a real thing in an emerging market like South Africa? Curious as to your thoughts, Simon, Ashlyn, Alan. What are you seeing? Ashlyn?
Yeah, and I was going to reply to Jose's question, because I do think the circular economy represents a future for the way businesses need to think and the way we need to be configured. We're moving to a world where we need to be stewards of everything that we produce, and that's ultimately what the circular economy is about. If I think about South Africa, and Jose, I agree with your comment, I think we're still, across many industries, at the start of the journey. I think you've seen some big focus on recycling, but a lot of that's very superficial. I do think there's massive, massive opportunity if we get the circular economy principles right on a few different pieces, right? One is we can create new industries linked to the recovery and reprocessing of goods. And we don't do that well enough. We don't have generally the facilities or the scale to be able to do this properly. But I do think that's a massive opportunity, which talks about creating new jobs, creating new industries that we could work within. I think there's another industry we could consider in the circular economy around secondary market development for recovered goods. Because often I think there's a attitude in more developing markets, to be honest, where when something gets to end of life, the typical response would be to dispose of it. So there's a massive piece around a education culture piece to get us to understand the embedded value of waste. And I think that's something which most corporates, most municipalities, most governments grapple with. But I do think getting that right creates all of these opportunities. I think the one big constraint is and Alan's highlighted this quite a bit, but the technological and potentially the funding around creating this new value chain to reprocess and create value from things that are designed with very short useful life cycles in play. And that is a challenge. And I think there's also linked to that a bit of a tension. If I think about a discussion with a multinational and OEM, there's often a discussion and a tension around if we were to increase the lifespan of, just say I'm buying a new car, if that car gives me 10 years of good service, surely the manufacturer on the other end will say, well, how do I augment that revenue stream? Because I'm going to lose a sale every 5 years. And there's that constant tension, right? But I think what's been pleasing is if I reflect, certainly in the mining industry, a lot of the big OEMs have actually come up to us with new innovations to extend product life or to recover parts of goods and provide an alternative way for us to reduce the capex that we would spend on new equipment through refurbishments, etc. So I do think the circular economy in pockets, I think in 2 or 3 years, it's going to be a very different discussion because it will be embedded across organizations so differently. But I do think there's some great lessons and opportunities that are ripe for the picking, especially in markets like ours where there has been a lack of regulation around the way waste is managed, or an inefficient means to dispose of waste. And I think the circular economy challenges much of that.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ashton. Much appreciated. So then, gentlemen, just to honor time and wrap up, it's time for us to just do a last round, 30 seconds of closing comment and reflections. Simon, I think we'll come to you first, then Alan, and then close off with Ashton. So Simon, closing thoughts.
Yeah, I can just say thank you for everybody who was in this session and who was interested to listen to our thoughts. And yeah, for me, I think the biggest topic is really to raise awareness for sustainability in a country like South Africa or in an emerging market, and use our positions and yeah, be open-minded for change, because if we would not do that, then it will be difficult. And a good example for me, for example, is the SPPP. So there was 2 gentlemen who developed the idea to have a sustainable procurement professional platform, and that is running well now. So, and with this activity, they are raising awareness, and I think from our side, in the positions where we are, we can do the same. And yeah, I think we just need to be open-minded for this change, and slowly we will make a change.
Thanks, Simon. Much appreciated. Alan.
Yes, this is the beginning. I think this is a great opportunity to start to raise that awareness of sustainable procurement and how much more we as procurement professionals can contribute towards this goal. I know that there's a course out there, so I think it's 2400 sustainability course that is available for professionals who want to get educated in this area. But certainly, for me, it's been a great to be part of this group, to do my little bit for South Africa, to contribute and to show where we are currently and what our thoughts are in this particular area. But we are at the beginning, and we have got quite a bit of way to go. But I think we're on the right track. Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. And then Ashlyn.
Yeah, just thank everyone. Thank you all for your attention. Really appreciate it. I think it comes down to us. It comes down to us being smart about the way we think differently about procurement and the value we create for people. So pleasure to be part of this group.
Thank you, Ashlyn. And then from my side, it's been a real privilege. The team is going to be sharing with you an audience a poll just to give some feedback. So please share that with us and how this session met your expectations. But from my side, Aidan Choles, Director of DBK Advisory. Thank you to the panel, Ashlyn, Simon, Alan. It's been a privilege to share this time with you, and enjoy the rest of the seminar. And if you are in South Africa, enjoy the rest of your Human Rights Day. Signing off. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Yes.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Aidan.